Fernandez was sitting at home when the phone suddenly rang. She picked it up and immediately heard the voice of a woman she had recently met. The woman greeted the landlady and asked for permission to come in. Nora Fernandez was surprised but said she was glad to see her. Elvira Velasco was already sitting in the elderly woman's room with a cup of aromatic coffee in hand. The landlady asked the young woman a question. "I understand you didn't come here out of simple curiosity. I understand my visit is unexpected for you. I wanted to speak with you during my first visit, but I couldn't because I had urgent matters to attend to. I've already heard about your situation, but I wanted to hear it straight from the source, meaning, from you. And the most important question, why did you do this to your children?" Elvira asked in a low voice. "Why do you want to know?" The older woman nervously touched her scarf and said, "I came from the city to your village, which means I need to know. But if it's hard for you to talk about it, I won't insist," Elvira responded. "Well, if you're really interested, I can tell you everything, but it won't be a short story. I have plenty of time, and you're right to say that I really do need to know this story. After all, you and I will be seeing a lot of each other soon," said Elvira. The elderly woman looked at her guest with a sad expression, then wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and began her story. "It all began so long ago," Nora started, her voice trembling slightly. "Back when I was just a girl, before all of this, before the mistakes, before the regrets. Life seemed so much simpler back then. I was the only child, and my father died when I was 15. My mother never remarried after his death. She lived for me. Maybe that's where everything started to go wrong, when her world revolved solely around me." Elvira watched the older woman carefully, sensing the heaviness of the memories that were beginning to surface. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves from the open window. It felt as if time itself had slowed down to accommodate Nora's unfolding story. "My first love was Gutierrez," Nora continued, her lips curling into a faint, bittersweet smile. "He was a year older than me. We were inseparable, or so I thought at the time. He had this charm, this confidence that made me believe we would be together forever. When we'd been dating for a few months, I told him something that, looking back, might have been the first mistake." "What did you tell him?" Elvira asked softly, leaning in slightly. "I told him that if he ever left me, I wouldn't survive it. I was young, naive, and in love. I believed that he would be the meaning of my life. My mother had lived her life for me, and I thought I would live mine for him. It seemed so natural, so romantic." Nora's voice grew wistful, as if recalling the innocence of that time. Elvira's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered with understanding. "And what did he say?" Nora let out a soft chuckle. "He promised me that we'd grow old together, that we'd never betray each other. We'll die on the same day, but as old people," he said. It felt like a fairy tale. She paused, her smile fading. "But life isn't a fairy tale, is it?" "No," Elvira agreed quietly. "It's not. We were young, foolish. I was 18 when I realized I was pregnant. I still remember the panic I felt. I didn't know how to tell my mother. She had warned me time and again, if I got pregnant before I turned 18, she would throw me out of the house. She wasn't a harsh woman, but she was strict. I was terrified." Nora sighed deeply, as if the weight of that fear still clung to her after all these years. "Did she throw you out?" Elvira asked, already sensing the answer. Nora shook her head. "No. She was angry, of course. She said terrible things in the heat of the moment. But after the shouting, the scolding, she forgave me. I think she saw herself in me, how she had given up her life for my father, how she had clung to me after he died. Maybe she thought I was repeating her mistakes." Elvira stayed quiet, letting Nora lead the conversation. "Gutierrez and I got married. It all happened so quickly. I didn't even have time to feel like a bride. We had a daughter, Agueda, and I thought that was it, that I'd found my purpose, that being a wife and mother would fill whatever hole had started to form in my heart. But life has a way of changing things, doesn't it? Nora paused, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her lap. Elvira watched her, the silence in the room growing heavier. Agueda was only 2 when I found out I was pregnant again. I was thrilled, but Gutierrez, he wasn't. I'll never forget how he reacted when I told him. He said 2 children were a luxury, that we couldn't afford it. I was devastated. We had always talked about having a big family, but suddenly, all he could talk about was money, practicality. He even suggested I end the pregnancy. Elvira's breath caught slightly, but she said nothing, allowing the story to unfold. I couldn't believe it. This was the man I had promised my life to, the man who had sworn we'd grow old together. And now he wanted me to get rid of our child. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped between my love for him and my desire to have this baby. I turned to my friend Margarita for advice, but even she wasn't sure what to say. In the end, I made the decision on my own. You kept the baby, Elvira said, more of a statement than a question. I did. I thought Gutierrez would come around, that once the baby was born, he'd change his mind. But he didn't. He grew distant, cold. He stopped coming home on time. I started to suspect there was someone else. And then, one day, I confronted him. I asked him straight out if he was seeing another woman. Nora's voice trembled, and her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. He denied it, of course. Called me paranoid, said I was imagining things. But I knew. I could feel it in my bones. He wasn't the man I had fallen in love with anymore. Something had changed. Did you ever find out for sure? Elvira asked, her voice low, as if afraid of the answer. Nora nodded slowly. A few months later, Gutierrez was in a car accident. He didn't survive. Neither did the woman who was with him. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Elvira didn't know what to say. She had expected a complicated story, but this was more than she had anticipated. I found out at the funeral, Nora continued, her voice barely a whisper now. The woman's husband told me the truth. Gutierrez had been planning to leave me for her. She was pregnant with his child. Elvira's heart ached for the woman sitting in front of her, for the years of pain and betrayal that Nora had endured in silence. She could see now why the older woman had been so hesitant to share her story. And that's how I lost everything, Nora said, her voice hollow. I lost my husband, my marriage, my trust. I had to pick up the pieces for the sake of my children, but a part of me never recovered. I never will. Elvira sat in stunned silence, the weight of the story pressing down on her. She had come seeking answers, but what she found was a tale of heartbreak, betrayal, and survival. I'm so sorry, Elvira finally whispered, though she knew her words could do nothing to ease the years of pain Nora had carried. Nora wiped her eyes again and smiled weakly. I'm used to it now. I don't expect sympathy. I just wanted someone to know, to understand why things turned out the way they did. Elvira nodded, feeling the gravity of the story settling deep within her. Thank you for telling me. I won't forget it. Nora looked out the window, her gaze distant. You'll be the last person to hear it. After all these years, it's time to let it go. Nora was born in the countryside, an only child who spent her early years surrounded by the quiet rhythms of rural life. Her father, a hard-working farmer, passed away unexpectedly when she was 15, leaving a void in both her and her mother's hearts. From that moment on, Nora's mother never remarried, dedicating her entire life to her daughter. The bond between them grew even stronger after her father's death, as they leaned on each other for comfort and companionship. Nora, despite her close relationship with her mother, always longed for a love of her own. That love arrived in the form of a boy a year older than her, who she met at a local festival when she was 16. He was charming, with an easy smile and a gentle demeanor, and Nora was immediately drawn to him. His name was Tomas, and soon enough, their encounters became the highlight of her days. For Nora, Tomas represented everything she had ever dreamed of. He was not only her first love but also her closest friend, the one person with whom she could share her hopes and fears. They spent countless afternoons together, walking through the fields, talking about their future, and dreaming of a life beyond the small village. Tomas was different from anyone she had ever known. He made her feel seen, cherished, and understood in a way that no one else had. As their relationship deepened, Nora realized just how much Tomas meant to her. He became the center of her world, her everything. She had grown up watching her mother remain devoted to the memory of her late husband, and that same devotion had taken root in Nora's heart. It was as if she had inherited her mother's capacity to love fiercely and unwaveringly. After 3 months of dating, Nora's feelings for Tomas had solidified into something she believed was unbreakable. One warm evening, as they sat together under a large oak tree that overlooked the fields, Nora spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. She turned to him, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "If you ever leave me, I won't survive," she said quietly, her eyes searching his. "I'm like my mother, I'm in love for life. So let's promise that we'll always be together and never betray our love." Tomas, surprised by the intensity of her declaration, took her hand gently in his. He looked at her with a mixture of affection and uncertainty. Though he cared deeply for Nora, the weight of her words felt heavy, almost too much for a boy barely 17. He wasn't sure what the future held for him, for them, but he didn't want to lose her. So, in that moment, he squeezed her hand and said, "I promise, Nora. I'll never leave you." Those words reassured Nora, giving her the sense of security she desperately needed. From that day forward, she held on to that promise as if it were the foundation of her entire existence. Tomas became her reason for everything, her studies, her dreams, her hopes for the future. She pictured their life together, growing old side by side, raising children in a home filled with love. However, as the months passed, the realities of young love began to take their toll. Tomas, though affectionate and kind, started to feel the pressure of Nora's intense devotion. He wanted to explore the world beyond their village, to see what life had to offer, while Nora's dreams remained firmly rooted in their small, shared future. The promises they had made under the oak tree, once so comforting, began to feel like a burden to him. Nora, on the other hand, remained steadfast in her love. She sensed that something was shifting in Tomas, but she refused to believe that their bond could be broken. She clung to the idea that their love was eternal, unshakable, just as she had seen with her mother's love for her father. In Nora's mind, love was not something that faded, it was a commitment, a promise that was meant to be kept no matter what. One evening, as they sat together in the familiar spot under the oak tree, Tomas finally spoke the words Nora had feared. He told her that he needed space, that he wasn't sure if he could fulfill the promise they had made. He cared for her deeply but felt that life had other plans for him, plans that might not include her. Nora's heart shattered. The idea of Tomas leaving her was incomprehensible. She had built her entire future around him, around the promise they had made. Tears filled her eyes as she begged him to reconsider, to stay, to remember the love they had shared. But Tomas, though clearly torn, remained resolute. He needed to follow his own path, one that no longer aligned with hers. "I'm sorry, Nora," he whispered, standing up and walking away, leaving her sitting beneath the oak tree alone for the first time. Nora's world collapsed. She returned home that night, her heart heavy with grief, and confided in her mother. Her mother, who had once known the same kind of love and loss, held Nora close and whispered words of comfort. But deep down, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost more than just a relationship, she had lost the meaning of her life. As the days turned into weeks, Nora struggled to find herself again. She realized that, like her mother, she had poured all her love into one person, believing it to be a forever kind of love. Now, with Tomas gone, she had to figure out how to rebuild her life, piece by piece, without the one she thought would be by her side forever. Yet, as time passed, Nora learned that love, though powerful, was not always enough to bind two people together. It took more than promises, it took understanding, growth, and sometimes the willingness to let go. What sad thoughts you have. Of course we'll be together, and we'll die on the same day, but as old people, Gutierrez said, his voice filled with youthful confidence. He smiled as if the idea of growing old together was a certainty, something inevitable. Nora, clinging to his every word, felt a sense of comfort in his promise. They were young, but in her heart, she believed in the timelessness of their love. Later that day, Nora shared the conversation with her friend Margarita, who was sitting beside her in class. As she told the story, her eyes lit up with excitement, still fresh from the sweet exchange with Gutierrez. Margarita, however, wasn't so easily swept up in the romance. She smirked sarcastically, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please. You guys are at that age where people fall in love 100 times before they even know what love really is," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Nora's smile faltered for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, genuinely confused. To her, what she had with Gutierrez felt real. The way he looked at her, how he held her hand, it all seemed like the beginning of something lasting. "I'm saying that you're both caught up in the moment," Margarita replied, leaning back in her chair. "Everyone feels like that at first, thinking they'll be together forever. But things change. People change. I've seen it happen a million times." Nora frowned. "But Gutierrez is different. We're different." Margarita raised an eyebrow. "Different how? You've known each other for what, a few months? How can you be so sure?" Nora looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "It's just. I can feel it. He makes me feel like no one else does." Margarita sighed, her expression softening a little. "Look, I'm not saying you shouldn't be happy. It's great that you have someone who makes you feel special. But don't be naive. People say a lot of things when they're young. They promise the moon and the stars, but when life starts throwing real challenges at them, all those big promises don't mean much." Nora didn't respond right away. Deep down, she knew her friend had a point, but she didn't want to admit it. She wasn't ready to let go of the idea that Gutierrez was her forever, the boy who would stand by her side no matter what. A few days passed, and Nora found herself replaying Margarita's words in her head. She tried to push the doubts away, but they lingered like an unwelcome shadow. One evening, as she sat on the porch, Gutierrez joined her. The two sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sun dipping low on the horizon. "You've been quiet lately," Gutierrez said, glancing at her. Nora looked at him, unsure of how to voice her fears. "Do you really think we'll be together forever?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gutierrez seemed taken aback by the question. "Of course I do. Why would you even ask that?" "It's just, people say a lot of things when they're young," Nora began, hesitating. What if things change? What if we change?" Gutierrez frowned, his expression serious now. "Nora, I can't see the future. But I know how I feel right now. And I love you. I want us to be together. Isn't that enough?" Nora felt a lump in her throat. She wanted so badly to believe him, to hold on to the certainty of his words. But Margarita's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that life wasn't always as simple as young love made it seem. "But what if it's not?" she asked quietly. Gutierrez took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." Nora smiled, feeling a little lighter, though the doubt still lingered in the back of her mind. Gutierrez had a way of making her feel safe, even when everything else felt uncertain. As the weeks went by, life continued, and Nora and Gutierrez's relationship deepened. They spent long afternoons together, sharing dreams about the future, talking about where they'd live, what kind of family they'd have. Nora allowed herself to get swept up in the fantasy, believing that maybe, just maybe, their love could defy the odds. But in quiet moments, when she was alone, Margarita's words still haunted her. She couldn't help but wonder if their relationship was just a fleeting chapter in their young lives, destined to end like so many others. One afternoon, as they sat under their favorite tree, Gutierrez looked over at her and said, "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" "About what?" Nora asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "About what your friend said, that we're too young to know what love really is," he replied, his eyes searching hers. Nora hesitated, then nodded. "I can't help it. What if she's right?" Gutierrez smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She might be. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean what we have isn't real right now." Nora sighed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I want to believe that." "Then believe it," he whispered, wrapping his arm around her. "We'll face whatever comes, together." In that moment, under the shade of the tree, Nora allowed herself to believe him again. Even if life would change, even if they wouldn't last forever, she wanted to hold on to the magic they had for as long as she could. After all, the future was uncertain, but the present was theirs, and for now, that was enough. Nora looked at her friend and replied, "For me, there was only one love, and that was Gutierrez." Her voice softened as she continued, remembering the past. "When I was finishing school, I found out I was pregnant. I still remember the exact moment I realized it. I had gone to visit Gutierrez while he was stationed in the army. We spent the night together, and it felt like the whole world had shifted. I was happy, really happy, but I had no idea how to tell my mother. She always warned me, if you get pregnant before you're 18, you'll be out on the street. And I knew she meant it." Nora paused, her eyes distant as she recalled that time in her life. It wasn't just fear of being kicked out. "I loved Gutierrez so deeply back then. I thought nothing could come between us, not even my mother's strictness. But I also knew that telling her would change everything. She was the type of woman who ran a tight ship, everything in our house had to be perfect, including her expectations of me." Margarita leaned in, listening intently as Nora unfolded her story. "What did you do? How did you handle it?" she asked softly. Nora gave a small, bitter smile. "I kept the secret as long as I could. For weeks, I hid it from everyone, even Gutierrez. He was so focused on his duties in the army, and I didn't want to add to his stress. I thought I had more time to figure out what to do, but then the morning sickness started. I couldn't hide it anymore." Anna leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with what Nora was going through. "You're not alone in this, okay? We'll figure it out together. But, Nora, you need to talk to your mom. It'll be hard, but she needs to know." Nora sighed, wiping away the tears that had formed in the corners of her eyes. She knew Anna was right, but the fear of her mother's reaction weighed heavily on her. Would her mother yell? Would she be disappointed? Would she even support her decision, whatever that might be? "I'm just so scared," Nora admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't want to let her down. She's always expected so much from me, and I don't know how she'll handle this." Anna gave her a comforting smile. "You don't have to do this alone, Nora. You've got me, and no matter what happens, we'll get through this. Maybe your mom won't react how you think. You never know, she might surprise you." Nora nodded, though the knot of anxiety in her chest remained tight. She appreciated Anna's support, but the thought of confronting her mother still felt like a looming storm. Later that evening, as Nora lay in bed, she thought about the conversation she would soon have to have. She imagined her mother's face when she finally revealed the truth, the anger, the disappointment. But Anna's words echoed in her mind, giving her a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things wouldn't be as bad as she feared. She knew the time to hide was running out. "I'll tell you everything, but you have to promise not to tell anyone." "I need advice, and I don't know who else to turn to," Nora murmured, and then she told her friend about the pregnancy and her mother's warnings. Margarita laughed in response and said, "All mothers say that, but when faced with reality, they don't throw their children out. Your mother might give you a hard time at first, but that's it. Don't be afraid to tell her you're pregnant. If I were you, I'd worry about something else, how your lover will feel about it. I suppose you haven't told him yet." "He doesn't know yet, but we talked about it before." "Gutierrez said that if I got pregnant, I would keep the baby," Nora said quietly. Months passed after that conversation. Nora's mother noticed her daughter's growing belly and immediately accused her of leading a shameful life. Nora tried to justify herself, telling her mother how much she loved the young man and that she wouldn't give him up. Nora had to endure many lectures from her mother, but in the end, she forgave her and didn't kick her out. Nora felt relieved after her mother found out. Now she just had to wait for her boyfriend to return from the army. He had already been informed about the pregnancy, and they needed to formalize their relationship. On the same day that Nora called Gutierrez and told him she was expecting his child, he proposed to her. A while later, Gutierrez returned from the army, and soon the young couple got married. After the wedding, they decided to live with Nora's mother, and later they had a daughter named Agueda. Nora happily embraced the role of motherhood and took pleasure in caring for the baby. Time passed, and soon Agueda turned 2. Nora took her to daycare and was about to return to work when she realized she was pregnant again. The young woman told her husband, with whom she had a harmonious relationship, when he returned home from work. "Gutierrez, I'm pregnant again," she said softly. "I'm not thrilled about it," said the head of the family. "Are you saying I should have an abortion?" Nora asked, expecting a different reaction from her husband. "Look, having 2 children is a luxury nowadays. You know my salary as a handyman at a sugar mill barely covers food and utilities. We're lucky your mother helps us, or we wouldn't make ends meet. So, do you think we need another child right now?" her husband said, clearly unhappy with the news. "I can't believe you're saying this. You and I always dreamed of having at least 3 children, and now you're talking about not having enough money," she said, nearly in tears. "Do what you want." "I've told you my opinion," he said before leaving the house, making it clear he wouldn't continue the conversation. After Gutierrez left, Nora sat tiredly in a chair, realizing they had just had their first argument since the wedding. The young woman wanted another child but didn't know how to face her husband's reluctance. She decided to consult a friend and called Margarita. After some small talk, Nora interrupted her and said in an elevated tone, "I'm pregnant." "Oh, congratulations," her friend exclaimed. "I'm happy about it, but my husband is against having a second child. I don't know what to do." "I'm sure it'll be a boy this time," said Nora. "Well, I can't give you advice. You'll have to make your own decision." "Maybe your husband isn't ready to be a father again," Margarita replied. "Do you think if I keep the baby without my husband's consent, we'll have problems later?" Nora asked. "You're strange. You're his wife, not me." "So, you know what to expect," Margarita responded. After the conversation, Nora thought deeply and decided to talk to her husband again. However, Gutierrez asked her not to bring it up again, saying he had already given his opinion and the decision was now hers. Nora decided to keep the baby and told her husband. Gutierrez shrugged and said nothing. Time passed, and Nora soon found out she was expecting a boy. She excitedly told Gutierrez, thinking he would be pleased to have an heir. But she was disappointed when her husband only nodded and didn't say anything. Shortly after, Nora gave birth to a son named Constantino. She was indescribably happy and thought she had a perfect marriage and model family. However, a month after the birth, things began to change. When the baby fell ill, Nora had to stay in the hospital with him for 15 days. During that time, her husband rarely visited, which hurt her deeply. After being discharged, she noticed that Gutierrez often came home late. Nora demanded an explanation, but Gutierrez brushed her off. That's when Nora suspected her husband was seeing another woman and confronted him directly. Gutierrez was angered by the accusation and said, "What makes you think that? Don't you have anything better to do than come up with fantasies? But you've become cold as ice in bed. What else am I supposed to think? You're always late from work. I'm a person too, and I deserve to be considered. You've changed in such a short time. Even my mother has noticed," she said, trying not to cry. "Stop being so dramatic. I don't have anyone else. Let's talk about your mother's savings. Ask her to give them to us. I told you a while ago I want to buy a car. Talk to your mother and get the money so we can buy one. We can't save enough on our own, you know," her husband said. Nora could only nod obediently. After the conversation, she felt frustrated and didn't know how to change the situation. She asked her mother for help, but her mother responded that the money was for a rainy day, and she didn't want to spend it. Time passed, and Margarita returned to the village after her studies. When she visited Nora, she immediately noticed her friend seemed down. Margarita frowned and said, "What's wrong? You don't seem happy to see me." "Don't be silly, I've been waiting for you. It's just that things aren't going well between my husband and me, and it's making me feel awful. I think he's seeing another woman. I've tried talking to him many times, but Gutierrez always brushes me off," Nora said quietly. She thought she knew everything about her husband. "My mother told me that she often sees your husband with a charming blonde. I don't know what their relationship is, but trust me, it's not friendly. I didn't ask you about it over the phone because I thought you would bring it up yourself, but you haven't said anything. I didn't want to fill your head with my problems," said Nora in a low voice, feeling she was about to cry in front of her friend. The young woman now clearly understood that her husband had been lying to her all along and truly had a passion for someone else. Margarita replied that she would ask her mother for details and call Nora that night to tell her everything. Then the guest asked what Nora planned to do now that it seemed clear Gutierrez had a lover, but there was no response, as her friend couldn't bear it and began to cry. Margarita hugged her and whispered, "Don't cry. Go see a fortune teller and perform a magic ritual, just like people get rid of their lovers nowadays. There's an old woman in the nearby village who does that, they say she can work miracles. But don't tell your husband. Rituals must always be done in secret." Margarita soon left, but she didn't call later that evening. When she finally did, she informed Nora of where her mother had seen Gutierrez with the blonde. The young woman asked her mother to babysit and rushed to the given address. Nora already knew she wouldn't be able to hold back and would confront her husband in front of his companion. And sure enough, she saw Gutierrez walking alongside the beautiful blonde, chatting cheerfully. The couple approached a house where a large hazelnut tree grew and took cover behind its trunk. Immediately, Nora imagined Gutierrez was about to kiss the blonde. She couldn't stand it and ran toward the tree to see what was happening. Nora arrived just as her husband was about to kiss the woman. She immediately screamed at Gutierrez in fury, accusing him of deceiving her. Then she turned to the blonde and said, "Aren't you ashamed? He has 2 small children, isn't that enough for you? I'll tear out all your hair." Nora was on the verge of grabbing the stranger's hair, but her husband stopped her firmly and spoke with severity, "Don't make a scene. Do you want people to see us fighting? Go home now, and I'll come later. Are you crazy? I'm your wife, and you're staying here with this woman. I'm not going anywhere. Let everyone know you're a sneaky womanizer." Nora raised her voice. The man grabbed his wife by the hand and led her away, telling the blonde that he would call her later. Nora tried to free her arm to slap the stranger, but Gutierrez held her firmly and gave her a sharp nudge to push her farther away. Once they were home, Nora started shouting at her husband, calling him a traitor and a scoundrel. The young woman's mother witnessed the whole scene but remained silent during the reprimand. Gutierrez listened to his wife screaming for a while and then, irritated, said, "Will you stop making such a fuss? Yes, I have another woman, and I love her. She's been visiting her grandmother for a while, and Sandra will return in a week. Now that you know, I want you to understand I'm going to divorce you. Don't make it a big deal, life is like that. Love fades. That's what happened to me. You're still young, and you'll find someone else." Nora was left speechless, unable to believe her husband had said those words. She had expected him to apologize and admit he'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, she heard that Gutierrez wanted to leave her for the blonde. Nora sat in shock, unable to bear the situation. She let out a roar of frustration, but Gutierrez didn't try to calm her down. He left the house, and her mother came over to gently stroke Nora's head, just as if she were a little girl. This tender gesture made Nora cry even harder. After a few minutes, her mother said, "There's no need to cry. Let him go his way. You and I will raise your children together. I'm not too old yet, I'll keep working. When Constantino turns 2, we'll put him in daycare, and you'll find a job. Mama, I don't want a divorce. I love Gutierrez, and I want to stay with him. Let that woman go, and maybe he'll forget about her. Then we can be happy again like before," Nora sobbed, truly believing that things could still change if only the other woman were out of the picture. Nora remembered her friend's advice to visit a fortune teller. The next day, she asked her mother for money, and although her mother looked at her daughter with sadness and said that love couldn't be conjured, Nora persisted, begging for the money. Sighing, her mother promised to go to the bank the next day and give it to her. Nora hugged her mother with joy, convinced that the fortune teller from the nearby village could surely help. When Gutierrez returned home that evening, he defiantly made his bed in the hallway. Nora tried to be affectionate with him, but he simply ignored her. Not knowing how to influence the man she loved, she tried talking to him again, but this time without shouting or insults. "Honey, you can't leave me like this. You and I are made for each other. I understand you've been stressed and maybe looked at that woman, but she'll be gone soon, and we can start fresh as if none of this ever happened. I promise I'll never mention it again," Nora pleaded, her voice soft. "You're so stupid. I've already made up my mind, and now I'm leaving. Please, leave me alone before I say something I'll regret," Gutierrez replied angrily. Nora clenched her teeth to avoid yelling again and obediently left the hallway for the children's room, where she cried silently, filled with resentment and humiliation. Yet she still held on to one last hope, that a magical ritual might help her keep her husband. The next day, Nora impatiently waited for her mother to return from the bank with the money. When she finally got it, she asked a neighbor to drive her to the nearby village. The elderly neighbor agreed in exchange for a small payment. Soon, Nora was sitting in the fortune teller's home, a woman known as Estella in the area. Estella listened carefully to Nora's story, then asked to see her palm. Nora extended her hand, watching anxiously as the old woman studied it. Estella gazed at the palm for a few moments and then said, "I'll help you, but you don't need it. He will leave you, but only temporarily. I'll give you the ritual instructions, and you must follow them exactly. Don't tell anyone about it, not even your mother." "I'll do whatever you say," Nora replied eagerly, but then asked another question. "Why did you say I don't need it?" The old woman looked at her thoughtfully and slowly said, "I saw in your palm that your fates are intertwined, but later they will separate. That's all I can tell you. I'll show you how to perform the ritual and give you the spell." Estella calmly explained the steps to Nora and wrote down the spell in a notebook, handing it to her. Nora paid her, and the old woman nodded approvingly, wishing her luck. Nora returned home feeling optimistic, convinced that the ritual would save her marriage. That same night, Nora's friend called, asking about Gutierrez and his affair. Nora confirmed that her husband indeed had a lover. Margarita, upon hearing this, immediately asked, "What are you going to do about it?" I can't tell you everything right now, but you'll understand later. I went to see Estella, and now it's up to me. In any case, I won't let that blonde take my husband without a fight, Nora replied firmly. If it were me, I couldn't forgive such a betrayal. I'd be disgusted imagining my lover kissing another, Margarita responded. You've never been in love, that's why you say that. When you meet someone you can't imagine life without, you'll talk differently, Nora said sadly. On the night of the ritual, Nora followed Estella's instructions precisely. Afterward, she felt a sense of relief. A month passed, and Gutierrez remained distant, sleeping separately in the hallway and rejecting all of Nora's attempts to approach him. Though it hurt, she endured it, not wanting to worsen the situation. Her mother disapproved of her daughter's behavior, but Nora said nothing. One day, Gutierrez announced he was leaving and began packing his things. Nora watched in horror as he gathered his belongings. She recalled Estella's words that he would leave for a while and then return, but she hadn't expected him to go like this. Grabbing Gutierrez's hands, she knelt before him, pleading, "Please don't go. I can't live without you. I'll do anything to keep you by my side. Don't grovel like that. Get up right now. I hate seeing it. We've talked about this. I'll file for divorce later. When I get a job in the city, I'll send some money, but only for the kids," Gutierrez said, clearly irritated. Nora understood that no words could change his mind at that moment. Silently, she stood up and sat in a chair, resigned to the fact that her husband was leaving. When he finally left, Nora felt like she was sleepwalking. She went through the motions, picking up her daughter from daycare, cooking, cleaning, but all the while, she was numb inside. Her mother tried to distract her, but nothing worked. Margarita, who visited often, also saw how devastated Nora was. 6 months passed, and Nora began to smile more. She took her children out more often, which brought some relief to her mother and Margarita, who had both been concerned. They thought Nora had finally moved on from Gutierrez, but Margarita soon realized she was mistaken. One day, in a conversation with her friend, Nora suddenly said, "You know, I'll probably never marry again. I've come to realize that I'm a one-man woman." "You're saying you're still waiting for Gutierrez? Are you crazy?" Margarita asked, incredulous. "You'll meet someone else who appreciates and respects you. Gutierrez will come back to me. That's what the fortune teller said, and I'm waiting," Nora replied calmly. And indeed, Gutierrez returned unexpectedly when Constantino was 7 months old. He arrived with a huge bouquet of flowers, a doll for their daughter, and a toy car for their son. Nora opened the door herself and let him in without saying a word. Gutierrez asked if they were happy to see him. Nora nodded, still in shock, as she stared at the man she loved. Gutierrez put his arm around her and kissed her on the lips. At that moment, Nora decided she wouldn't ask him any questions. She was just happy he had returned. Her mother, on the other hand, received him with far less joy. She disliked the man and didn't hide it. When Margarita found out, she immediately called Nora and scolded her for forgiving him so easily. "You're crazy for letting that scoundrel back into your life," Margarita said. But Nora didn't care. All that mattered was that the man she loved was back with her. Gutierrez didn't explain why he had returned, and Nora didn't ask. He acted as if he had never left for another woman, which suited Nora just fine. She didn't want to know the details. Soon after, Gutierrez found a new job, and life went on as if nothing had happened. Nora welcomed her husband back warmly, trying to be as kind as possible. 3 months after his return, Gutierrez came home one day looking melancholy. Nora immediately noticed his agitation and asked what was wrong. "Let's sit down and talk calmly. Let's agree not to say anything too heated or make accusations," Gutierrez began. "Sandra called me today. She wants me back, and I'm going to go. I still love her, and I can't do anything about it. I know I'm hurting you again, but that's how things are. Nora stared at him in disbelief, feeling sick to her stomach. How could this be happening again? That dreaded Sandra was taking her husband away once more. Make sure in the morning that Gutierrez doesn't hurt you again, Nora was told. A couple of weeks later, Gutierrez spoke about leaving soon for work. The news saddened Nora, and she tried to convince her husband to change jobs, but Gutierrez declined the offer. Hugging his wife gently, he said, "I'll only be gone for a month. I promise I'll call you often, and before you miss me, I'll be back to kiss and hold you again." "You haven't even left yet, and I already miss you," said Nora. "Well, that's a good thing. So, in a month, we'll have a warm reunion. By the way, honey, I wanted to talk about money. Can you lend me some? I'll pay it back when I return from work. Don't ask why I need it, I want to surprise you." "You trust me, right?" he asked softly. "But I'm saving it, like my mother used to. I don't even know what to say to you." "Don't worry, I'll handle it somehow," he said, silently walking into the kitchen from the hallway. "Wait, fine. I'll give you the money tomorrow, but you promise to pay it back," Nora said, immediately realizing her husband was in a bad mood after her hesitation. Once Gutierrez knew she would give him the money, he turned back and hugged her, then whispered his thanks into her ear. Nora didn't ask why he needed the money, she trusted him completely. Soon after, Gutierrez left. He hadn't lied, she gave him the savings from her late mother. The man promised to call every 2 days and also asked her to stay faithful. Nora laughed at the request, saying she needed no one but him. Several days passed, and Gutierrez didn't call. Nora couldn't settle down, thinking about what might have happened to the man she loved. She waited a few more days before going to the police to report her husband's disappearance. The investigator asked her for details and told her it was too early to worry. If he had gone for work, perhaps his phone had been stolen, and he couldn't remember her number to call. The uniformed officer also advised her to wait until his shift ended. Nora left the police station in a bad mood and went to talk with her friend about Gutierrez. Margarita listened intently as Nora explained her husband's departure, and it was only then that Nora mentioned giving him the money. Margarita looked at her guest as if she were crazy and said, "You can say goodbye to both your money and your lover. I don't believe that story about work. He should have called the next day to tell you he arrived safely, but he didn't, and here you are searching for him with the police. Jesus, when will you wake up? You're a mother of 2, but you're not smart enough." "Rita, Gutierrez had money, and something could have happened to him," Nora argued. "Well, don't worry. They'll find your lover with some blonde woman, and you'll be fine with the Gutierrez situation. Just tell me one thing, if he leaves you, would you forgive him again and take him back as if nothing happened?" her friend asked quietly. "I don't even dare to think that Gutierrez would do such a thing, which is why I can't answer your question," Nora responded sadly. Some time later, the police called and told her that her husband was fine and living in the city. Nora was relieved that he was okay, but she didn't understand why Gutierrez hadn't called her. She asked the same question to her friend. Margarita frowned and murmured, "He's got you wrapped around his finger. He came here, said some sweet words, and you melted. You still love him, and Gutierrez took advantage of your feelings. He asked for money and disappeared without leaving his phone number. Your husband is sneaky. Honestly, I'd be scared to talk to a man like that." "Do you think Gutierrez cheated?" Nora asked weakly. "I don't think it, I'm sure of it. Think about it, why hasn't he called you? His shift is over, and where on earth is he? You need to make a decision about this man. I understand love can be cruel, and you've fallen for an idiot, but this is beyond ridiculous. Stealing money from his own wife and children? This is unheard of," Margarita said indignantly. Nora went home feeling completely drained. She didn't want to believe her friend's words, but the truth was that Gutierrez was still living in the city, and she couldn't ignore the reality. Calmly in the city and in no rush to appear, the woman sat tiredly in an armchair in the living room and broke down in tears out of resentment. Why? Because of Gutierrez. She had been willing to do anything for him, only to find out that he had merely been using her. Once again, months passed, and Gutierrez neither appeared nor called. Nora herself no longer knew if she was waiting for her husband's return or not. She simply lived for her work and her children. Now, she had only one goal, to ensure her son and daughter wanted for nothing. By now, Constantino was already attending elementary school, and Nora was very aware that the children's expenses were increasing little by little every year. So, she decided that this summer, she would plant a full garden, not partially as she had done before. Nora wanted to produce more to sell by the highway on weekends. She had read about this idea in a newspaper. Nora shared her plans with her friend Margarita, who immediately began to scold her. "What on earth are you thinking? You already have a hard job, and now you want to work in the garden. Don't you think about yourself? You know you can't earn all the money. Your kids are dressed just like everyone else's. So don't ruin your health like this." "I don't want Constantino and Agueda to be dressed just like the others," Nora said softly. "I want them to be dressed better than the others. And I don't want people to pity me for being a single woman barely making ends meet." "You amaze me with the way you think," Margarita replied. "You're going to spoil those kids, I swear. Look at what I'm telling you." Margarita was angry because Nora refused to feel sorry for herself. Summer came, and Nora threw herself fully into her garden during the weekends. One afternoon, as she was planting seedlings, she suddenly heard a man's voice calling her name from behind the fence. Nora looked up and saw Gutierrez. She straightened up and stared at the man, who was smiling calmly. Nora walked to the fence and nodded in greeting. "What do you want here, Gutierrez?" she asked. Her husband replied quietly, "We need to talk." Nora smiled in response and said, "I think there was a time for that, but it's long gone. So there's not much left to talk about. Not between you and me, anyway. Wait, listen to me. At least let me explain why I did what I did. Maybe you'll understand. You're the only person who's ever truly understood me. Let me come into the yard, it's awkward standing here by the fence. After all, you're still my wife," he said. "I'm your legal wife, yes, but that's my fault. Next time I have a day off, I'll go file for a divorce. If you've come here to ask for money, I'll tell you right now, I don't have any. What else could you possibly want?" "I don't even know myself," Gutierrez muttered. "Don't tell me it's love. I trusted you so many times, and you consumed everything I had," she said calmly. "Yes, we should talk like civilized people, but let me be clear, I won't live with you again. My life is easier when I can rely only on myself. I don't think we should continue this conversation any longer." Gutierrez called out to her several times, but she ignored him, turning back to her garden. He stayed there for a while, waiting for her to come back, but Nora kept planting, never looking his way again. Gutierrez spat angrily and left. Nora spent a little longer planting, then went home to her children. She patted them on the head and told them that she'd warm up dinner, and they would eat together. After feeding her son and daughter, Nora called her friend and told her about Gutierrez's visit. Margarita listened in silence, without unnecessary questions, and when she heard that her friend had stood up to her husband, she was sincerely happy. "I can't believe you did it. You always thought of Gutierrez as untouchable, and then you turned your back on him. His ego must have been crushed. I can't imagine the look on his face when you said no. I don't know what was on his face. It feels like I've woken up from a long nap. What matters to me now is to finalize the divorce. The rest is irrelevant. I don't want Gutierrez back in my life." After speaking with her friend, Nora let out a sigh of relief. She felt calm. Rejecting her husband had lifted an invisible weight off her shoulders. I am your father, and I had a good reason for being away. I served time in prison and was recently released, so I came straight to see you, said Gutierrez. I don't care where you've been. Mom and you deserve each other. Dad doesn't pay child support, and Mom doesn't take it out of pride, Agueda replied harshly. Nora hadn't expected her daughter to make that comment. At first, she felt disoriented. Then she raised her voice, asking Agueda to watch her mouth. The girl shook her head and walked into the house. Gutierrez merely smiled at his daughter and said aloud, "What bad luck, raising children who talk like that about their own mother. I can imagine what Constantino will say when we meet him. For God's sake, leave, Gutierrez. You have nothing to do here. I doubt our son would be happy with the father who abandoned him as a baby. I'm asking you to get out of my life. I don't meddle in yours, so don't meddle in mine," said the woman, her voice trembling. "And what about your love for me? I remember you saying you loved me the last time we talked," Gutierrez added mockingly. "That was a long time ago. It's all forgotten, and nothing can be recovered. My only wish now is for you to leave. I don't think I've done anything wrong this time. Be a man and go," said the woman of the house, her voice faint. "Fine, I won't bother you again." "I'm sorry for everything," the man murmured, then turned abruptly and walked away. After that visit, Gutierrez never appeared in his ex-wife's life again. Nora entered the house after Gutierrez left and immediately went to her daughter. She asked Agueda to explain her behavior outside. The arrogant girl told her mother she had only spoken her mind. Nora approached her daughter and quietly asked, "Did you purposely reject Gutierrez's child support? I think if a man wants to help his children, he should express that desire instead of acting out. In this case, your father didn't want to help, and I wasn't going to force him. Don't blame me, every person has their principles." After this brief conversation, Nora noticed that things had become tense between her and her daughter. Before, if her mother asked her to do something at home, Agueda would do it, though not always happily. Now, Agueda turned a blind eye to everything. Nora couldn't understand why she couldn't get along with her daughter. She called her friend and shared her problem. Margarita listened and then said it was Nora's fault that Agueda acted this way. Nora interrupted her and asked for help understanding the situation instead of finding fault. Margarita realized her friend was deeply upset about her relationship with Agueda. So she said, "Let me try talking to her. Maybe I can do it better. I won't sugarcoat it. I'll tell her the hard truth. You be firm with your son. Don't think I'm blaming you for everything. Do you think I haven't been a mother and a father to my children? And I still had to work hard to make sure they weren't deprived of anything," Nora said, nearly in tears. "Don't cry. I'll talk to Agueda today. No, I can't promise, but tomorrow for sure. We'll get through this," said her friend. Margarita confronted Agueda and bluntly asked why she was being so rude to her mother. Agueda, with arrogance, said she didn't discuss such matters with outsiders. Margarita looked at her, surprised, then indignantly asked, "Who do you think you are?" Agueda stared back defiantly and said, "What is there not to understand? You're Aunt Margarita, but now I see you think you're a grown-up, telling me these things. Did you forget I used to wipe your nose? Watch how you talk. I'm not your mother, and I won't be kind to you. I'll put on a mean face, and all your heroism will disappear in an instant," said Margarita, furious, barely restraining herself from slapping her friend's daughter. Agueda stood there, mockingly watching her mother's friend. The girl said nothing, wondering what Margarita would do next. It was as if Margarita realized Agueda was testing her patience on purpose. Then she said sternly, "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I warn you, I'll make your life hell if you keep upsetting your mother. She exhausts herself for you and Constantino, and this is how you repay her. You're not a little girl, and you should know that you're setting a terrible example for your brother. I ask you to rethink your behavior." Margarita didn't know if her words had any impact, but she wanted Agueda to understand she couldn't treat her mother like that. Margarita sincerely believed that after this conversation, Agueda would stop being so defiant. Afterward, Agueda resented her mother, thinking it had been her who asked Margarita to lecture her. While she became less openly rude, Agueda began to distance herself, trying to avoid talking to her mother. Nora attempted to regain her daughter's favor, realizing that Agueda wasn't being mean but was still distant. As the school year flew by, Agueda was getting ready to leave for university in the city. Before she left, Nora asked her daughter to stay alert and keep a clear head. Agueda listened to her mother's warning with total indifference and, just before boarding the bus, said, "I'm so glad to get out of here. I'm sick of it, and I'll try never to come back." "And won't you miss me, daughter?" Nora asked, confused. "I don't know. Right now, I just want to leave and live my own life, where no one tells me what to do," Agueda replied coldly. She gave her mother a quick kiss on the cheek and hurried onto the bus. Nora wiped away her tears in silence and mentally wished her daughter a safe journey. She hoped Agueda would find happiness and come to visit her soon. A month passed since Agueda left, and Nora called her daughter 2 days later. But Agueda was brief, saying only that she was fine. Nora wasn't satisfied with the short answers, she wanted to know everything in detail. However, after exchanging a few words, her daughter quickly ended the call. A year passed since Agueda left. In that time, Nora had only heard from her daughter once. She was deeply worried. Margarita saw her friend's anguish and did her best to support her. Margarita knew about her friend's illness and saw how difficult it was for her to handle even the most common household chores. Margarita offered to call the children to help Nora adjust, but she declined the offer. After talking to her friend, Margarita accidentally ran into her neighbor Leonilla, with whom she had a conversation. Leonilla mentioned that she often heard Nora crying. This was because she could no longer handle simple tasks, like fetching water or taking out the trash. Margarita talked with the neighbor for a while, and the women discussed how they could help Nora. Leonilla said she visited Nora whenever she could but couldn't be there all the time because she had her own family to take care of. Margarita thanked the neighbor for remembering her friend. After speaking with Leonilla, Margarita realized that Nora really did need help. She would have helped, but she also had a 2-year-old grandson to take care of while his mother was in the hospital. So Margarita decided to speak with a friend who had offered to call the children for a while. But as soon as Nora found out, she immediately asked her friend to forget the offer. Margarita looked at her friend in confusion and asked why she had refused. Nora replied that she didn't want to become a burden to anyone, especially not to her children. After the conversation, Margarita found another way to help her friend. She arrived at a solution, calling Nora's children without her knowing. The first thing she did was call Agueda, sternly saying, "Your mother is struggling. She needs help. Come immediately, and don't tell me you have urgent matters. If I don't see you in 3 days, I'll call your husband. At least he treats your mother much better than you, and you know I'll do it." After that, Margarita called her friend's son, Constantino, and also demanded he come. At first, he said he was busy, but Margarita threatened to cause him trouble at work, saying she would tell how he had abandoned his mother in her time of need. In response, Constantino reluctantly agreed and said he would be there in a week. Soon after Margarita's calls, both siblings arrived in town. When Nora saw her children, she was overjoyed. At that moment, she had no idea it was her friend's doing. The woman was happy that her daughter and son had come to visit her. However, her joy was short-lived when she overheard them talking in the kitchen. Agueda was the first to speak, saying, "Do you think I'm going to stay here long? I could use some extra money from selling the house, but I'm not going to take care of Mom. If it weren't for Aunt Margarita calling me, I wouldn't even be here. She said she'd tell my husband that I abandoned Mom, and my husband is perfect in his attitude towards the elderly. He even treats my mom well and respects her. But I don't know why Aunt Rita called and promised to cause me trouble. You know how she is, if she says she'll do something, she will. Sometimes, I hate Mom's friend. Constantino replied in a dull voice, what are we going to do now? Agueda responded, neither of us would mind the extra cash. And you know Mom isn't going to complain. She'll probably go to the store soon for bread or milk, and while she's out, we'll pack up her things. Then we'll say she's lost her mind and should be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. After that, you and I will get the property, or rather, the money from selling it. That's not a bad idea, but you'll handle all the issues with Margarita, Agueda whispered. Nora overheard the entire conversation, frozen in horror. Was this really all her children cared about, getting a share of the house sale? She couldn't understand how her kids could be so cynical towards their own mother. Quietly, she retreated to her room and called her friend, briefly telling her about the children's plan. Barely able to contain her anger, Margarita asked what Nora was going to do. Nora was silent for a moment, then said, I have a plan, but I need help. If you can, please come right away. Margarita arrived an hour later, and Nora shared her idea. She wanted to sign the house over to an institution that would take care of her. The children would only be informed at the last moment. Margarita initially tried to talk her friend out of it and even offered to move in with her. Nora smiled and said, I already owe you so much, but I have to decline your offer. I don't want to be a burden on you. You have your life, and I have mine. Besides, you've always wanted me to take control of my future. Well, I'll have the chance to do that in a new place. Maybe I'll meet my soulmate at the retirement home and spend the rest of my life with him. At this point, Nora Fernandez paused in her story and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Elvira Velasco, who had been listening attentively, sat quietly, deep in thought. When the guest realized the elderly woman had stopped talking, she asked, Why did you stop? I'm completely engaged. What more do you want to know? Everything is clear, the old woman replied softly. Not everything. I understand that you called a notary and left your house to the care home. But how did you tell your children? You stopped at a very interesting part, said Elvira Velasco, who was in charge of the retirement home. It's simple. After my friend and I went to her guest house, where I had a lovely time, I told her that this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. After that, I secretly invited a notary. Margarita helped me keep it a secret from my children. The will was drawn up, transferring my property to your care. The next day, my neighbor and Margarita came over and suggested I go to the store, supposedly for a walk. Naturally, I agreed. Before leaving, I asked the children to pack my things so I could take them while I got bread. Their reaction was surprising, they were stunned. In silence, I listened to Agueda accuse me of being delusional. Then I informed them that the house now belonged to a retirement home. You should have seen their faces. They started screaming that I had no right to do that and even accused me of not being of sound mind. Fortunately, I wasn't alone at the time. My neighbor and friend heard all the shouting. Later, Agueda called her husband, saying I had lost my mind. She said many bad things about me, but she's still my daughter, and I won't speak ill of her. After saying this, Nora Fernandez cried again, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. Elvira Velasco was quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. Finally, she said, You've shocked me with your story, but I can tell you told it just as it happened, without exaggeration. And believe me, it wasn't easy for me to listen. Nora smiled through her tears, Have I scandalized you with my tale, or perhaps bored you? But I shared it just as it occurred. Elvira nodded, I'm impressed by your story. I can't condemn anyone because it's your life, and only you can make these decisions. I understand how hard it must have been to live through this again as you told it. The two women fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Nora stood to open it, finding her neighbor Leonilla, who had brought a fish pie. Nora smiled and welcomed her in. Leonilla entered, saw the company, and said, "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I just wanted to drop off this pie. My husband caught some fish yesterday, and I thought I'd share with you." "You're always welcome here, Leonilla," Nora said with a smile. "By the way, this is Elvira Velasco. I'm moving to her care home soon." The neighbor smiled warmly. "Nora, you've done so much for this neighborhood. You've taught children so much. I've always admired you." Nora made a serious face and then looked intently at her friend. Margarita immediately noticed her change in mood and said anxiously, "What happened?" "You know I won't let it go until I know the truth. How are my children?" "My heart aches for them," Nora murmured. "Don't worry. If something were wrong, they would have come to you long ago or to me. Plus, Agueda and Constantino know where you are," her friend replied gently. For 2 months, Nora had been living in a boarding house. Then, something happened in her life that she never expected. She met an older man at the boarding house named Crespo. At first, it was just simple communication between them, talking about different things. But over time, Nora realized that she had fallen in love with him. Soon, Crespo proposed to her. Nora couldn't believe that at the end of her life, she could fall in love again with all her heart, but it had happened. She agreed to marry him. Nora called her friend to tell her the news, and after a brief moment of stunned silence, her friend congratulated her. "But I need to meet your fiancé. If he doesn't pass my face control, I'll reject him," she teased. "You're incorrigible," Nora laughed. "You know, I'm starting to think I should move into your boarding house. It sounds like a lively place." Margarita replied. When Elvira Velasco heard about the wedding, she called Nora into her office for a chat. "I've heard there will be a change in your life, and I'm happy to congratulate you," Elvira said. "You and Crespo seem to be in harmony, and you look great. I want to tell you something, your house hasn't been sold yet. If you want, the boarding house can give it to you as a wedding gift. It's your choice. And don't worry, it's perfectly legal. We have the right to revoke the will, and you can change it. I'll have to consult my future husband. After all, he will now be the head of the family," Nora said with a smile. "Of course," Elvira responded. Getting married to the man she loved wasn't the last happy event in Nora's life. On the day she exchanged wedding rings with Crespo, she saw her daughter standing nearby with her husband and child, and Constantino standing close by. Nora cried when she saw her children. Her daughter rushed toward her, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Forgive me, dear, if you can. I've done many hurtful things, and I'm so ashamed in front of you." At that moment, Nora's son approached her with a bouquet of flowers and knelt down to ask for her forgiveness. Nora couldn't believe that both her children were there, asking for forgiveness. She glanced over her son's head and saw her friend's satisfied smile. Nora realized that Margarita had played a part in this. At the wedding reception in the boarding house dining room, everyone sincerely congratulated the elderly couple, wishing them peace and happiness. Nora felt doubly happy that day because now she had both her beloved and her children by her side. After the celebration, Nora called her friend and, alone, said, "You know, I have to admit, you're the best friend I've ever had, and I'll never have another like you. I know my children didn't show up at the wedding by chance. It's all thanks to you. You've helped me more than once, and I'm so grateful. I don't even know how to thank you." Through tears, she said this, and Margarita replied, "Let's not cry. Don't forget we've been friends since high school, and we've always trusted each other. Now, let's talk about happy plans for life, that's much more interesting." If you liked the story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.